On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Max Mergenthaler-Canseco. He is the CEO and co-founder at Nixla. We're going to talk about startup success. So Max has a great background. He's had multiple startups, and we're going to talk to him about how he uses some of that experience, the previous failures, the learnings, and everything in between. Also, we're going to talk about survivorship bias, and as well, he's had experience both as a CTO and a CEO when it comes to being a founder. So we're going to tap into Max's experience in all those areas and hopefully a little bit more. Max, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks so much, Amir. I'm extremely happy to be here and happy to have this conversation.
Absolutely. Okay. Tell us what Nixla does before we get going in the show.
Nixla stands for time in Aztec, which is one of the languages that was spoken in Mexico before the Spanish conquest. And we're a time series research and development company. So our vision is to become the go-to solution for time series forecasting and anomaly detection.
Awesome. Well, there we go. That's a good spot to be right now. And we're going to talk about, I guess, a little bit about your experiences within startups, right? And you had multiple startups. And I guess maybe before we start, to set the context, tell us a little bit, just a quick, snapshot of how many startups you've launched, some of your experiences, and then we'll kind of keep going for the conversation.
Yes, absolutely. So this is the third startup that I have launched, and the history is I started first playing with some NLP algorithms and building or trying to build a startup around monitoring Twitter on a large scale to try to identify trends and political actors. That was back when I was in Mexico. And I wouldn't count that as my first startup, but it was definitely my first entrepreneurship project. And I learned a lot in that phase. We can talk about that more detail later. Then I was CEO and co-founder of a demand forecasting startup that was selling to some of the largest CPGs in Latin America. After that, I was CTO of Playbook, which was a financial marketplace that was backed by YC. And now currently I'm the CEO and co-founder of Nixla.
Awesome. All right. So, I think where I'd like to start with this is, somebody who's gone through working with multiple startups, I guess the expectation is you've learned what has worked and what has not worked. I actually wanted to focus on how you understand those learnings, because obviously with a big enough lens, you can look back and you can dissect what's happening. But obviously, as you go to the next startup and you're in the middle of it again, it is way harder to stop and go, oh, I remember this from the other startup, and I'm going to go ahead and apply my learnings like it's a theoretical experience. When you enter your next startup, when you enter your next venture, how do you hold the previous experiences that you've had within other startups?
I think that's a profoundly interesting question and also an extremely tricky one, because besides all the startups that I have founded, I have been able to join very different accelerators and startup networks. So I have been part of YC, I have been part of Techstars, I was part of the AWS Gen AI Accelerator, I was part of Google AI for Latino founders. I also was part of a specific program in Latin America called Latitude Ventures. So besides all the first-hand experience in trying to build the companies that I was involved with, I have also been in direct exposure with some of the most, if you want, prestigious and common startup schools or startup founding or theoretical entities. And I think the question is very interesting because there is what you could refer as the theoretical knowledge around startups. So all the different guides, books, common wisdom that is imparted and taught at this and shared in these different accelerators and some very famous books like The Hard Things About Hard Things and Lean and all those specific pieces of literature. And then, of course, there is the practical experience of building a startup. And I think the first thing that has to be understood and acknowledged is that every startup is really different than other startups. And of course, me as a founder, I'm a different person than when I was a founder 3 years ago. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a main theoretical, philosophical problem about how do you apply the general experience, either theoretical or practical, to the very concrete, specific point in life where you are as a startup founder. And to be a little bit more concrete, I think the first thing that changes is and that has helped me and that I have learned is less about let's say the theoretical curriculum, the specific things now that I learn, and maybe more about the person that I have become, the personal experiences that I have lived, and have how that has helped me be a better founder, a better leader, also identify faster where I'm falling short. So I think it's a lot about growing personally, and that means very concretely being more resilient, maybe very concretely balancing between the optimism and the excitement of becoming and making the next unicorn, but also the realities of the statistical fact that most startups fail, how to deal with the team members, how to deal with investors, how to deal with reject, and how to deal with success. I think that is probably what I would think it's the highest or the most important experience. Then, of course, there are some very practical things that we can talk about, very concrete lessons that I have had, and then I think everyone should at least hear.
And then plus, every startup is a different business. It's a different business opportunity, a different business dynamic. I mean, unless you're literally, even if you're reproducing a franchise, it's still very difficult to actually go, I'm going to do exactly what I did and it's going to work. I mean, I think that's very foolish. It's not how businesses actually do anything. So when you look at your experience of being a previous founder, as you approach your next startup, yeah, it sounds like you have a toolbox, right? You have a toolbox of various experiences, and you want to leverage some of those, right? Obviously, you want to be open-minded. And I think this is maybe more art than science type question, but when you look at that, of wanting to be open-minded towards a problem versus going, I've already done this, right? There's a first-time founder has a certain amount of eagerness, right? A certain amount of naivete to becoming a founder. Second, third, fourth, fifth time serial founders, they know they've stepped on quite a bit of landmines along the way. How do you still maintain that passion for a startup, knowing that there's going to be some trials and tribulations?
The classical, and I think most canonical advice for startup founders is build something people want, which is the YC slogan. And the idea behind is that if you do build something that people want, that, and of course execute correctly, everything will follow, right? And I think that is extremely important because at least the very first thing that I was building with the NLP Twitter, I think it was an incredible product that nobody wanted, and it was condemned to fail. So on the other side, I think the answer to your question is not necessarily to build something people want, but maybe equally as important, build something that you like building. Because at the end of the day, the everyday problems of running the startup, the high risk associated with it, it's only going to be sustainable in the long term if you are passionate about what you are doing, if you are in a place where you like it, being surrounded by people that you want to be surrounded with. And I think that's my personal take to it. I do believe that this is a probabilistic game, and I think the best way to win at it is by keep playing it, and at some point, statistically, you will have more odds of succeeding. But the only way to keep playing is to really enjoy the game, and enjoying the game means being as passionate as you can for the topic itself. So customers are very important, probably the most important part of a startup, the market, the demand, the investors. But I think the real secret is being passionate about the product, being passionate about the problem, because otherwise, at some point, you're simply not going to be able to keep doing this.
I guess as you're kind of building out your team, and you're trying to put those people you mentioned, the people that share that common belief, that common goal, they're on board to want to join. I guess when you look at the past startups you've launched, is there a certain type of person that you are looking for, I guess, identifying within that, like that type of person? Because obviously people are going to say, I want people that can be gritty, they can wear multiple hats, right? But I think it's more than that. I think there's a component to people who join early stage startups that need to be there so that you can actually know they're there to solve problems with you, not just to be told to work on problems. I mean, that mold is not easy to evaluate. I mean, what has been your experience when you're building out that early stage team to find those right individuals for yourself?
Yes, in my very personal experience, one important aspect to understand is that there is a fundamental difference between being a founder and being the founder and the founding team of a company, and being an employee at the early stage, medium stage, late stage. And that difference is important because there are some founders that I think are mistaken in trying to expect that the early collaborators have as much passion, as much grit, and also as much effort into building the startup as the founding team. And from management perspective, I don't think that's right. I think it's important to understand the difference, because it's not fair, in my opinion, and also not sustainable to expect that someone will be working the same as you, because the stakes in the game are also different. And given that this is a game and the stakes do matter, I think that's one very important thing to understand. That being said, I think one crucial aspect to hiring early collaborators in a startup is people who have a passion for solving problems. I think solving problems and actually executing that is extremely important, because the reality about startups is that they are not only unique, but in constant flux. So they are unique every single, not day, but maybe every 2 weeks is a new startup in some senses. So no CEO, no CTO is going to be able to have a very concrete set of tasks that is going to be needed for the next 2 years. And having someone that can reply to that or respond to that dynamism and be able to solve it. And if he's not or she's not able to solve it, learning how to solve it and then solving it, I think makes for great early founding collaborators.
That's fantastic. I mean, obviously you've been, you're the CEO, you've been CTO. I guess as a founder, as part of a founding team, do you see much difference, or well, I mean, there's much difference, but what are the differences that you've kind of experienced? Where, because obviously you have a fantastic background, you've gone through the process of being a very technical person to being a CEO. When you look at those skill sets, how have you operated in kind of both of those different functions?
And I think this is becoming the main musical theme of the podcast. But I think my answer as a preface, it's going to be very unique to my experience. And I think that's interesting, because all CTOs, all CEOs, all CFOs, all CMOs in this early stage startups, I think should take a lot of the advice that is published out there and that is given by mentors with a grain of salt. That being said, I think there are not many, but some particular differences between, of course, the CTO and the CEO. I more and more see the role of the CEO as trying to establish this big vision, as like maybe the captain of a ship that is trying to reach. Let's stay with although of course I'm not in favor of imperialism and the conquest, but let's take the example of Cristobal Colon. This weird idea of, hey, let's try to go to another continent and find India through this different route in the sea. And the main responsibility of the CEO is, in that sense, having that idea, but also making sure that the team functions properly. So, for example, I take a lot of pride in saying that I'm the worst person at selling at the company, and that's why we have excellent account executives. I'm the worst person at coding at the company, and that's because, or not the best, and that's because we have excellent engineers and so on. So I see my role more, or the management role, the CEO role, much of as an enabler that helps the team succeed and go to the mission and the destination that we are trying to achieve together. The CTO is someone that is responsible that the ship actually works, that the ship doesn't have holes, that the sails are maybe aligned in the right position, so we optimize time, so that, I don't know what else, the ropes are well installed. So I think it's of course a leadership role, but it's a leadership role that involves a very specific task, namely, if you put it in other words, the CEO is about the what, and the CTO is a lot about the how, and that's important because sometimes as CEO you want to tell your CTO what to do, and I think that's in the long run very mistaken. The CTO should have full ownership of the technical roadmap.
I guess with given your experience, have you noticed that your natural abilities are suited to one or the other? I mean, you could be naturally suited to both, but have you noticed that you lean in one direction or another in terms of where your core skill sets are?
Yes, I think I would like to believe that I'm a better CEO than a CTO. In my role as CTO at Levo, I was in charge of the technical team, but I have learned the hard way and by having experience with now the engineers that we're working, that I'm a mediocre coder at best. So. So I'm very happy to accept that I think I'm a better CEO than a CTO, and yes, particularly for early stage startups where I do believe that it is extremely important that the CTO writes code and not only manages engineers.
Honestly, that's fantastic because I think, obviously, a little bit of a joke regarding your coding ability, which I'm sure you've overstated, but honestly, to understand that and to know where to put yourself in the best position possible, and I guess I'm going to ask you this question. We hadn't talked about it, but I'm kind of curious because I know out there everyone always talks about, you got to work on your weaknesses, right? You got to try to build out your weaknesses, try to focus on improving them, and heck, they're even an interview question. Tell me a weakness, right? I actually kind of look at the other way. I'm like, instead of me spending time on a deficiency that I might or might not move the needle on, I have other attributes that I could potentially more easily get from 1 to 10x than I'm trying to take something that's at 0.2 and try to get it to 1. The friction is high. I just was curious what your thoughts. I subscribe to the fact that if focus on what you do well and try to avoid the other things. Doesn't always, you can't always do that. But what do you think? Do you think we should focus more, especially in these founder roles, focus what you really do best and bring in people and don't worry about trying to remedy things that you are not as good at?
I think the answer to that relates to something that we mentioned before, namely the objective of the startup. And I think let's take your example of you are a 0.2 in I don't know, Python, and maybe a 0.7 in project management, and then you have other skills that you can map to a specific number. We have to remember that number is going to be multiplied by something. And the important thing is not that number in itself, but namely what you are multiplying it with and what the end result is. Because there are stages at a startup where maybe if you increase 10% in your coding ability, that would have far more impact in the outcome of the startup than being a better communicator or manager. And the opposite is also the case. If you improve your leadership skills, maybe that's gonna get a much more impact than if you become a better coder. And in my particular example, for me to be at the level that we need engineers to be at, I would need to spend far more time than what I need. And I think the impact now, it's better for me trying to focus on the management skills, understanding that is my role, and trying to enable the colleagues at the company, because that, in my opinion, will have a far bigger impact than trying to learn, I don't know, Rust or something that I don't know.
I think that's a great view of it as well. And I know you'd mentioned to me survivorship bias, right? And I think obviously we were talking about it in the context of previous experiences and what actually does get carried forward. And I was kind of hoping, at the time we have to have get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I really like this topic, and to simplify the one meme or one story. And in Second World War, there we're trying to understand how to build more resilient airplanes. So they started looking at all the airplanes that came back after a battle, and so where the holes of the bullets were like focused. And then they said, okay, let's reinforce, let's make those parts stronger. And they did, but the problem is that those were not the right planes to look at. The really important planes to look at were the ones that didn't come back. Namely, those were the ones that really didn't support the bullets of the enemy and fall down. And that's a classical, now almost a funny example of survivorship bias or sampling bias. But I think we are, or the startup ecosystem is plagued with that meme. And it's another funny example. We hear all the times about the college dropouts that made it to Facebook and now famously Elon Musk and so on. But again, statistically, that's not the way to proceed. You should look at the other people, not the anomalies that state, but namely how many that dropped out didn't become Elon Musk or didn't become Mark Zuckerberg. And more concretely, I think you can apply that same line of questioning to most of the advice that is canonical in startups. Namely, we hear all this advice, and most of that advice is based on very few success stories, very anecdotal evidence, not very rigorous counterfactual analysis, and that definitely poses a problem, because it's like, okay, if that's the case, and I do believe that's the case, then what do you do? And it's very complicated, because there might be some truth in what people are saying, and I find myself always like questioning certain like platitudes and common advice, like, hey, focus on this or focus on that other. And I say, now investors don't have idea, I will do whatever I want, and or I believe it's best based on my beliefs. And months after, it's like, fuck, they were right. So it's a weird balance between how do you choose which advice, which wisdom, which theories to believe in, and how do you reject them. But I think coming to a specific point, being aware of that survivorship bias, being aware of that sample bias, it's very important, I think, for startups and leaders and management teams to have present.
I like that a lot. It's funny because I think a lot of times people will look back and they will remember those couple of things that you just pointed out in the survivorship bias example. And I think that's the ones that stick in, and they think those are the ones that are the real stories behind how somebody got there. So I think, yeah, it's very interesting. I love the examples, by the way, as well. I read about the World War II airplane one when you talked about it, so I thought that was really good. Max, I know you got to actually get back to running a business. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you coming on and sharing with us and your insights. What is a good way, if somebody, we covered some different areas, but what is a good way of somebody getting in touch with you if they wanted to kind of follow up with you in something you mentioned?
Absolutely. Thanks, Amir, too. It was a very interesting conversation. I really enjoyed it. And I'm happy to communicate with you and your audience. They can reach me at max@nixla.io. And they can also follow me on LinkedIn. Just follow the link that I think Amir is going to provide somewhere. And I'm happy to keep talking to you. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. And thank you for coming on again. That's it for this episode. Be back again. Different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think when Max came on, we want to talk about kind of the path to startup success. I think we kind of accomplished that, but I think we actually touched on a lot of different areas, especially when it comes to learning from previous experiences and how you actually use that towards the next startup, or how you use that in the middle of your next initiative. And I think Max did a great job of kind of walking us through his thought process, having been a serial entrepreneur. So please share this with somebody else who might be interested or is in the path of wanting to start their own startup, and this would be great context for them. Also, like, subscribe, comment, let me know how the show is going for you. I'd appreciate that. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.